842 ships stopped answering at the same second. No blast lit the dark. No missile trail crossed the display. They were just gone, one after another, in a silence too clean to be a battle. Overlord Darketh stood on the observation deck of the Sovereign's Wrath and watched his fleet die without a single shot fired against it. 11 minutes ago, he had commanded 847 ships. Now the tactical display showed 5 scattered, drifting, their engines dark. The thing that had done this had powered up an hour before the attack. His scanners had called it a rock, a derelict, something not worth a second look. It had not fired a weapon it had not needed to. No warning, no missile trail, no mercy, just the slow, patient math of something that had been waiting 3 centuries for exactly this moment. Darketh's claws pressed into the rail until they bent the metal. Somewhere below him, on a bridge that had gone completely silent, Tactician Vex stared at a screen that made no sense. Behind him, Elder Sarvani had not spoken in 4 minutes, which for her was its own kind of alarm. A young gunner named Tessic, 26 years into his first command posting, had sent his mother a message an hour earlier telling her the human sector would fall by morning. His ship was not one of the 5 still moving. The Empire had conquered 38 systems in 24 centuries. It had never lost a fleet action. It had never once been wrong about a species it decided to erase. It was wrong now. You want to know how a ship with no weapons broke an empire? So do I. Let's go back to where it began. 3 days before, the decree arrived on the Warspire's central display in clean, formal script, the kind used for annexations that had already been decided before anyone voted on them. 3 human colonies. Administrative reclamation? No resistance expected. Overlord Darketh read at once, the way he read everything, fast, certain, done. Around him the Warspire hummed with the quiet confidence of an empire that had never needed to ask twice. Obsidian walls curved up into tactical haze. 847 ship icons sat in perfect formation on the display, a shape he had built 1 conquest at a time, 1 scar at a time. 11 scars crossed his chest now, 1 for every world he had personally taken. He did not need a 12th. This one would be easy. Elder Sarvani stood at the edge of the deck, where she always stood, half in shadow, the way her species preferred it. She was Velar, silver-skinned, slow-moving, 483 years old, a client species that had served the Empire for 9 centuries and had learned, in that time, exactly how much truth an overlord could tolerate, before a briefing, before it became insubordination. She had watched the human sector for 27 years. She had never once been asked what she saw there. Today, she decided to say it anyway. Overlord, before the fleet departs. There is an anomaly in the asteroid field the humans call the drift. Darketh did not turn from the display. A rock elder. There are 12,000 rocks in that belt. Should we catalog them all? It is not a rock, Overlord. It is 300 years old, and it is active. That got him to turn. Not because he believed her. He never quite believed her. Not fully, not in the way he believed a weapons scan or a fleet count, but because in 27 years, she had never once used the word active about anything. Define active. Power signature. Faint. Consistent. It has held the exact same output for as long as we have been monitoring it. Sarvani's throat pulsed once, the Velar equivalent of choosing words carefully. It does not fluctuate. Living systems fluctuate. Dead ones do not draw power at all. This draws power the way a heart beats. Slow. Patient. Waiting. Waiting for what? I do not know. That is what troubles me. Darketh studied the tactical display, where the drift sat as a gray smear at the edge of the human sector, marked with nothing but a routine hazard notation. 12,000 rocks. 1 heartbeat among them, according to a woman whose entire career was built on noticing things other people didn't bother to. He waited for exactly as long as doctrine required, which was not long. Imperial doctrine ranked threats by power output, and power output was the one number that had never lied to him in 24 years of command. A heartbeat at 147th, the strength of a standard warship, was not a threat. It was a curiosity. Log it, he said. Assign it a designation. If it changes state, tell me. Until then, it is not my concern. 3 colonies are. Sarvani inclined her head, the motion of someone who had expected exactly this answer, and filed it away anyway, the way she filed away everything. As you command, Overlord. Beside her, tactician Vex, a broad-shouldered Chrysar officer 47 years into a career built on reading fleets the way other people read faces, allowed himself a small private smile. He had served under Darkith for 11 of those years, through 9 conquests, and he had learned that the Overlord's certainty was not arrogance, it was accuracy. The man had simply never been wrong. "Fleet's ready on your word, Overlord," Vex said. 72 hours to the human sector at standard approach, then we go. Darkith touched his command chair once, the way he did before every engagement, a ritual older than half his crew, performed 47 times across his career, never once failed to return from. "Full formation, no stealth approach. Let them see us coming. Let them understand there was never a choice." The fleet moved. The Bastion Station 0400, 12 meters of tactical display curved along the far wall of the command center, mostly dark, mostly quiet. Admiral Valeria Torrance poured tea she would not finish and let it go cold on her desk, the way she always did at this hour. It was a habit older than her command, older than the war that hadn't officially started yet. Her grandfather had done the same thing, in the same chair, in a station that hadn't existed back then, and some nights she wondered if she kept the habit for him or for herself. The Bastion smelled the way it always did before dawn's shift, recycled air and the faint metal bite of a cooling reactor. Torrance liked it quiet. Quiet meant nobody had died yet. On her wrist, a mechanical stopwatch ticked against her pulse, her grandfather's watch. The case back read whole, worn smooth by 47 years of thumbs before hers. She did not know most days, whether she wore it as a comfort or a warning. Tonight it felt like both. The door opened without a knock. Commander Elena Reyes, 31 years younger than her admiral and still learning not to run indoors, stood in the frame with a data slate shaking slightly in her hand. "Admiral, they're coming." Reyes set the slate down harder than she meant to. "Chrysar Warfleet, full armada. Ultimatums already logged. Administrative reclamation of Avalon. Ceres Rest and the Ember Colonies. 72 hours to surrender or engagement." Torrance did not look up from her tea. "How many ships?" "All of them, Admiral. Every ship they have." That was the wrong number to hear at 4 in the morning, and Torrance knew it the second it landed. She set her cup down without drinking from it and finally looked up. Reyes had grown up on Avalon. Torrance had read the file years ago and never mentioned it. The way you don't mention a thing someone hasn't chosen to tell you themselves. She watched it now, the flicker behind the younger woman's eyes. Not panic, not yet, but the particular stillness of someone doing math about people they loved. "Get me the archive key," Torrance said. "The old one. The one nobody's used since my grandfather retired." Reyes hesitated. "Which archive?" "Project Shepherd." The name meant nothing to Reyes, and that told Torrance exactly how long it had been buried. Good. That was the point of burying it. "I've never heard of it," Reyes admitted. "Is it a weapon?" "No." Torrance stood, and the chair scraped softly against the deck. "It's older than that question." She walked the corridor to the sealed archive alone, past night shift officers who nodded and did not ask why the Admiral was awake before the alert klaxons had even sounded. She had known this morning was coming for 47 years. She had simply never said the date out loud, not even to herself, not even in the quiet hours when the whole point of the tea ritual was to sit with things she didn't say out loud. The archive door read her palm and opened onto a small, cold room that held exactly one object, a folded parchment inside a sealed case, yellowed at the edges, undisturbed since before she was born. The charter was 302 years old. She just looked at it through the glass for a long moment, the way you look at a door you've been told your whole life not to walk through, and let herself remember the one time he'd told her about it, not what it said, only that it existed. Her grandfather had signed it when he was 22. She had never opened it. She didn't open it now either, and that someday she would know when to use it, and that she would know because nobody would need to tell her. "You'll know," he'd said, the year before he died, when she was still young enough to think that was a strange thing for a grandfather to promise a child. "You'll just know." She turned and went to find her engineer. Marlowe's workshop? Chief Engineer Marlowe was already awake, because Marlowe was always awake, hunched over a console in a workshop that smelled like solder and old coffee gone bitter in the pot. 58 years old, 37 of them spent keeping other people's ships flying, and he still jumped a little when she said his name from the doorway. "Admiral." He turned, took one look at her face, and set down the tool in his hand. "You look like a woman who found out something she already knew. I need you to run a diagnostic on something that hasn't had power in 300 years. Marlowe's hands stopped moving entirely. The Asteroid Belt Project. Your grandfather's. You know about it? I know there's a hull out in the drift. Nobody's allowed to survey. Filed under structural hazard, permanently. I figured it was a grave. He turned in his chair fully now, giving her his whole attention, which from Marlowe was rare currency. Is it a grave? No, Torrance said. You're gonna wake it up. I'm going to try. Does it work? I don't know, Torrance admitted, and the admission cost her something. It's asleep. Marlowe studied her for a long moment, the way he studied a failing engine before he touched it, trying to find the one detail that would tell him everything. Because she had spent 47 years believing her grandfather about most things, and had never once had to test whether this particular belief was true. Nobody alive has ever seen it operate. That was the point. It was supposed to sleep until the day the math ran out, and the math's run out. 847 ships are inbound, Torrance said. I'd call that the math running out. Marlowe exhaled slowly and reached for his coffee, found it cold, drank it anyway. What do you need from me? Structural integrity read the moment it wakes. If it's rotted through after 3 centuries, I need to know before we bet the sector on it, and I need you quiet about all of it. Reyes doesn't know. The council doesn't know. Nobody outside this room knows what we're about to do. That's a lot of trust for one old engine, Admiral. It's not an engine. Torrance's hand went unconsciously to the stopwatch on her wrist. It's a promise. My grandfather made it. I'm the one who has to keep it. The signal out in the drift, 842 meters of derelict hull hung silent among the rocks, exactly where it had been left, exactly as it had waited, for longer than anyone alive had been counting. It had a name once. Nobody living remembered it. To the sensor logs of 2 governments, it was simply debris, catalogued and dismissed, a shape too large to be natural and too still to be a threat. Torrance typed the activation code from memory, 47 characters she had known since she was 12 years old and had never once been told what they belonged to. Her grandfather had made her memorize them as a bedtime ritual, the same way other children learned poems recited back to him every night, for a month until he was satisfied she'd never forget, and then never explained. Nothing happened for a long moment. Marlowe watched his console, jaw tight, one hand hovering over an abort key that wouldn't have done anything even if he'd pressed it. Admiral, if this thing's core degraded, activation alone could— Wait, Torrance said. Then, far away in the cold dark between rocks that had not moved in 300 years, something did. A single status light woke on the hull's exterior, dim green against black. Then another. A slow pulse spread along seams that hadn't flexed in 10 generations, metal groaning as something inside it remembered how to be warm. On Marlowe's console, a waveform appeared where there had been only silence a moment before, faint, steady, patient, exactly the shape Elder Sarvani would later describe to an overlord as a heartbeat. It's reading power, Marlowe said, disbelief thinning his voice to almost nothing. Admiral, it's alive. Whatever it is, it's alive. Torrance let out a breath she hadn't noticed holding for the better part of a minute. Her thumb found the stopwatch's worn case back without her telling it to, tracing the word engraved there the way she had 1,000 times before without ever quite understanding it. Hold. Not alive, she said quietly. Awake. There's a difference, and we're about to find out which one matters more. On the console, the waveform steadied into a slow, even rhythm, 47 pulses to the minute, and held. The waveform held its rhythm for 6 hours before Marlowe spoke again. He'd barely left his console since the pulse first appeared, and by the time he called the Admiral back down, the coffee in his cup had gone cold twice. It's not just powered on, he said, it's thinking. Watch. He tapped the display, and a line of text scrolled across the panel, slow and deliberate, like something choosing its words. Pattern detected. 72 hours to confirmation. Shepard Procol, Convisional Stanby. Torrance read it twice. It knows the fleet's coming? It knew before we told it anything. Marlowe said, it's been counting something this whole time. 300 years of counting, and the second it wakes up, it already has a number. Neither of them said what that meant. Neither of them needed to. By the second day, the Bastion's corridors had the particular quiet of a station bracing for something it couldn't yet name. Reyes ran drills she didn't believe would matter. Sensor crews doubled their watches on the drift, though none of them knew what, exactly, they were watching for. Torrance signed off on evacuation contingencies for 3 colonies and told no one that the real plan didn't involve evacuating anyone at all. She found Reyes alone in the observation deck that evening, staring at Avalon's blue curve on the long-range display. The way you look at something you're afraid to lose. "You didn't grow up here?" Reyes said without turning around. "I did. Ceres rest before that, then Avalon when I was 9. My whole family's down there, Admiral. My mother still keeps bees. I know. Do we have a plan? A real one?" "Not the evacuation drills." Reyes finally turned, and her eyes were steady, which Torrance respected more than she could say. "You've been different the last 2 days. Quieter." Torrance considered several answers and chose the true one, though not the whole of it. If it does what he believed it would do, nobody on Avalon needs to leave their bees. And if it doesn't, then we evacuate. Torrance said, "And I've bet the sector on a story an old man told a child 40 years ago." Reyes held her gaze a long moment, then nodded once. "There's an asset in the drift, old, my grandfather's work. The nod of someone choosing to trust because the alternative was worse." "Then I hope he was a good storyteller. He built moons," Torrance said. "I think he'd earned the right to a little faith." Aboard the Sovereign's Wrath, the fleet crossed the outer marker of the human sector on schedule, 847 ships holding formation with the precision of a species that had never had a reason to hurry. Scout Commander Kay Thal watched them come into view from her forward station, satisfaction settling into her like a held breath finally released. 31 years of service, and she had never once flown into a battle she expected to lose. She was the one who found the anomaly first, 3 hours before the fleet reached engagement range, a blip in the drift faint, holding an energy signature so small her console nearly filtered it out as noise. "Overseer," she said, pulling Vex's attention from the main display. "There's a contact in the asteroid field. Power readings negligible, 1/47th of a standard warship, maybe less. Could be residual charge off a mining rig." Vex glanced at it, glanced away. "Elder Sarvani flagged that sector 2 days ago." "Darket's order stand, ignore it. Continue approach." "It's moving," Cathal said. That got his attention back. "Moving how?" "Barely. Micro-adjustments. Like it's..." She searched for the word and didn't like the one she found. "Orienting itself." Vex studied the contact for a long moment, the old instinct of 11 years under Darketh warring with something newer, something that itched at the back of his mind the way Sarvani's warnings always did right before they turned out to matter. "Otherwise, it's not worth the Overlord's attention." "Understood." Overseer Cthal returned to her station, but she kept one eye on the blip for the rest of her shift, the small, stubborn part of her that had learned, over 31 years. He weighed the doctrine against the itch, and doctrine won, the way it always did on this bridge. Log it. If it enters intercept range of the formation, you have permission to fire a single warning shot. That the things worth watching were rarely the ones anyone else thought to look at. On the Bastion, the 3rd day arrived with the particular stillness of a held breath. Marlowe's console had gone quiet after the first status message, no further communication from the drift, only the steady, patient pulse of something waiting for its own countdown to finish. Torrance spent the morning in the archive room again, this time with the case unlocked, the charter resting in her palms for the first time in her life. She still didn't unfold it. She wasn't ready, not yet, and some part of her recognized that readiness itself was the last piece her grandfather had left for her to find on her own. Voss, her adjutant, found her there just past midday, a quiet, careful man in his 50s who had served 3 admirals before her, and outlasted all of them through the simple discipline of never asking questions he wasn't meant to answer. "Admiral. Fleets entered outer sensor range, 90 minutes to engagement by their approach speed. Any change from the drift?" "None. Whatever it's doing it quietly." Voss hesitated at the door. "For what it's worth, Admiral, whatever this is, the crew trusts you." "Nobody's asked what the contingency actually is. They just believe you have one." "That's a dangerous amount of trust to earn on a secret," Torrance said. "It's the only kind worth having." Voss allowed himself the ghost of a smile. The tactical display in the Bastion's command center filled slowly as the Chrysar fleet crossed into detectable range, 847 points of light, arranging themselves into a formation too vast for the human sector's meager 3 capital ships to meaningfully oppose. 90 minutes, Admiral." She set the charter back in its case, unopened still, and rose to meet the war. Around her. Officers went quiet the way people go quiet in the last minutes before something irreversible. Rhea stood at her shoulder. That's every ship they have, Admiral. All of them against 4 visible hulls and whatever's out in that belt. They don't know what's out in that belt, Torrance said. That's the whole plan. On the long-range feed, the Chrysler formation began its final approach, and far beneath the notice of 847 scanners tuned to detect warships, something with no weapons at all finished counting down to 0. 0 meant something was coming, and 847 ships weren't listening. Overseer, the anomaly still holding position. Cathal watched the drift contact on her console, her earlier itch sharpening into something closer to certainty. But its signature just spiked. Same power draw, new configuration. Something inside it changed. Vex barely glanced over. Configuration to what? I don't know. It's not weapons grade. It's not anything our threat library recognizes. Then it's not a threat. Vex turned back to the main formation, where the fleet held its slow, ceremonial approach toward 3 colonies that had already been told they had no choice. Fire a warning shot if it enters the formation's outer edge. Otherwise, ignore it. Call didn't argue. 31 years of service had taught her when arguing cost more than it earned. But she kept her targeting sensor locked on the small gray shape in the drift, and when it drifted 300 meters closer to the formation's outer edge 12 minutes later, she didn't wait for a second order. A single missile left her launch tube clean and precise, exactly the way Doctrine said it should. It traveled most of its distance in silence. Then, with the derelict hull still 8,000 meters out, it simply stopped. Not exploded, not deflected. Stopped, hanging dead in space as if it had struck a wall no sensor could detect, and then, over the span of 3 seconds, crushed inward on itself into a fist-sized ball of scorched metal. Overseer. Cathal's voice had lost its practiced calm entirely. The missile is gone. Not destroyed, gone. It's like something folded the space around it. Vex was already moving toward the command display. Doctrine finally cracking under the weight of a number his instruments couldn't explain. Show me! Chief Engineer Marlowe saw it too, 3 seconds later, from the bastion. His hands went still over his console. Admiral, it just stopped a missile without touching it. That's not defense. He didn't finish the sentence because he didn't have a word for what it was. It's exactly what my grandfather built it to do, Torrance said quietly. Move things, just not the way anyone expected. On the Sovereign's wrath, Darketh finally turned from the tactical display, drawn by the sudden stillness on his bridge. Report. A single contact in the drift, Vex said, choosing each word with the care of a man who could feel his certainty slipping and hated the sensation. It stopped a missile mid-flight, no detonation. No visible mechanism. Darketh's yellow eyes found Elder Sarvani, still standing at the edge of the deck where she always stood. Elder? Your heartbeat just answered a question I didn't ask it. It answered the only question that ever mattered, Overlord. Sarvani said. You asked what it weighed. You never asked what it was for. There was no time to press her further. On every bridge across 847 ships, alarms began sounding at once. Not weapons alerts, but something stranger, something none of their threat protocols had a category for gravitational readings. Climbing. Far out in the drift, a voice spoke on every Chrysler channel simultaneously. Calm and unhurried, the voice of something that had rehearsed this exact moment 1,847 times in 3 centuries of silence, and had never once expected to need it. Fleet configuration matches simulation, gravity well collapse pattern initiated. Estimated survival rate, minimal. The words meant nothing to most of the crews hearing them. They would mean everything in the next 11 minutes. Ship by ship, the formation began to bend. Not toward the derelict. Toward each other, drawn inward along invisible lines only the prototype could see, hulls groaning as forces no engineer aboard had trained for pulled at their frames. It didn't look like an attack. It looked like gravity itself had decided the fleet no longer deserved the space it occupied. Darketh gripped the rail hard enough to bend it, watching his formation fold inward like a hand closing. Full reverse, break formation now. It was already too late for most of them. The order reached ships that could no longer obey it, engines straining against a pull with no visible source, no target to fire on, nothing to fight, but the growing certainty that they had walked into something they had never learned to measure. Sarvani did not move from her place at the edge of the deck. She had spent 27 years learning to see what her empire refused to look at, and now, watching the thing she had warned them about finally show its true shape, there was no satisfaction in being right. Only the old, familiar weight of having been ignored exactly long enough for it to matter. "It's not a weapon, Overlord," she said, quiet enough that only he could hear it over the alarms. "It's a shepherd. It was built to hold worlds together, to move moons, not fight wars. And we sailed our entire fleet straight into its field." Darkith said nothing. There was nothing left in his doctrine that had a place for what he was watching, and for the first time in 24 centuries of imperial certainty, the silence on his bridge had nothing to do with confidence at all. The transmission came through on every channel at once, calm, ancient, unhurried by anything the Empire still understood. "You were warned, not by me, by your own doctrine." A pause long enough for the words to land on a bridge that had gone completely still. "You saw weakness. You saw silence. You did not see the shepherd." Darkith did not move. Around him, the Sovereign's wrath groaned under stresses it had never been built to survive. One of 5 hulls still holding shape in a formation that had, 11 minutes ago, numbered 847, no warning given twice, no mercy asked for. No ship spared that the shepherd hadn't chosen to spare. His hand found the arm of his command chair, the same ritual he had performed before every engagement of his career. 47 times he had touched it and returned. This was the first time he touched it after, and the metal felt like something belonging to a man he no longer recognized. Elder Sarvani's voice reached him through the static quieter now, almost gentle. "It was never meant to fight, Overlord. It was meant to hold. And it held us all." He looked past the wreckage, toward the derelict hull still drifting in the drift, untouched, unhurried, exactly where it had always been. It had not moved to strike them. It had simply let their own formation destroy itself against a truth their instruments had never been built to read. "Signal the survivors," he said finally, and his baritone had lost the click he ended every sentence with, as if even that small certainty had been spent. "We withdraw on the bastion." The tactical display cleared one red icon at a time until there were none left at all. Torrance watched the last of them vanish, and did not move for a long moment, the way you don't move right after a held breath finally lets go. Reyes broke first. "Admiral, my parents, Avalon, are they?" "They're fine, Elena." Torrance's voice was steady, though her hand had found the stopwatch on her wrist without her telling it to. "It never touched the colony. It was never about the colony. It was always about the shepherd." Marlowe's voice came over the comm, rough with something that wasn't quite disbelief anymore. "Admiral, final count, 842 destroyed. 5 disabled, drifting, no propulsion. 1 ship, the flagship, still under power and withdrawing. 842 ships had entered the sector. 842 never left it. Not one human casualty, not one colony touched, not one shot fired by anything wearing Earth's colors." Reyes let out a breath that shook only slightly. "What was it, Admiral? What did we actually build?" Torrance didn't answer right away. She reached for the cup of tea on her console, cold now the way it always was by this hour, and drank it anyway, the way she had every morning for 47 years without once knowing why the habit mattered until this exact moment. "We built a shepherd, Elena," she said, "and the Empire was just a flock that lost its way." She walked to the archive alone, the way she had 3 days before, except this time she didn't stop at the glass. The case opened at her palm. 47 signatures ran down the parchment in ink gone brown with age, engineers who had built something meant to move moons and had chosen instead. The charter came out into her hands, weightless and impossibly heavy at once, 302 years old and still holding the shape of every fold her grandfather had pressed into it. She unfolded it, to let it sleep until the day it was needed for something gentler than they'd ever imagined and larger than they could have said out loud. At the bottom, smudged by a hand that had signed it at 22 and never lived to see it used, was her grandfather's name. She read it once. She didn't need to read it twice. Whatever the charter said in its careful, formal language, the only sentence that had ever mattered was the one he'd told her himself, years before, in words too small for a document. "You'll know." She had known. She folded the parchment back along its 3 original creases and placed it in the archive. Not sealed this time, not hidden, just resting, the way a promise rests once it's finally been kept. Then she opened the stopwatch. She had worn it every day of her adult life and never once opened the case, only ever touched the outside, the worn hold stamped into metal by 47 years of her grandfather's thumb before hers. Inside, beneath the crystal, the mechanism still ticked, patient and exact, the same 47 beats a minute it had always kept. Out in the drift, The prototype's transmission came through one final time, quiet on a channel that had already fallen silent for everyone else. 3 words repeated with the same unhurried rhythm it had used for 300 years of waiting. We kept it, we kept it, we kept it. Torrance closed the stopwatch. The tick continued against her wrist, small and steady, the way it always had, the way it always would. She set it down beside the open charter and let both of them sit there together in the quiet, the promise and the proof. While somewhere past the colony's dark limb, the shepherd settled back into its long, patient sleep, waiting, this time, for nothing at all.